The clips from trailers, movies, and other YouTube videos are for educational use only. Enjoy our video podcast.
Picture yourself as a project manager during the planning phase or an execution phase of your project or program. And as you're reading the scope or rereading the scope, going through all the different details of your project, you start to notice that something big could really happen to cause the project or program to derail in a very severe way. And some of those consequences could be really severe depending on what happens. And then you think to yourself, what process would help me with something like this? And that, my fellow PMs, is called risk management, which according to the PMBOK refers to activities for minimizing project risks and thereby ensuring that a project is completed within time and budget as well as fulfilling its goals, or also known as the business value. Risk management, like scope management, cost, and schedule, is extremely essential because you want to ensure that you fulfill the business values, but you also want to ensure that nothing will stop you in any way, shape, or form from achieving that. But that also means that you may potentially have to think of risks that can cause issues in the future after the project has been fulfilled. Now, for sometimes risk management is not taken into consideration. We've seen many projects like that, such as, again, the FBI virtual case files is one of those. Their risk could have been that the fact that their systems were archaic, therefore required a lot more upgrading, and who knows how hackable it was. Or if we were to think about the Manhattan Project, which, of course, we now know the result of that. But let's look at a situation, not just a project, but a situation where risk management really should have played a huge part in it. And that is Chernobyl. We all know that Chernobyl was a nuclear disaster that happened on April 26 of 1989, and it was considered the worst civil nuclear incident that the world has ever seen. It resulted from a faulty reactor design that was operated by personnel who weren't properly trained, was rated a 7 on the International Event Scale, which is the most severe. This occurred in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant at the number 4 reactor, which was close to the city north of the Ukrainian SSR of the Soviet Union. Now, with the understanding of the introduction of Chernobyl, we are going to look at the purposes that risk management processes ensure for not just projects, but for afterwards. And those 3 things are that all processes and procedures established for risk monitoring and controlling are followed exactly, that all risks are understood by the entire team to ensure adherence to the established processes and procedures of risk monitoring and controlling, and the understanding of the consequence of action or inaction towards the risk management, monitoring, and controlling. Our first point in the purposes that risk management processes ensures is that all processes and procedures established for risk monitoring and controlling are followed exactly. Now picture this. In the planning phase as project managers, we have to be very conscious of not only identifying our risks, but then establishing policies and procedures in how to identify them, how to address them, and even what the mitigation is, how long it takes to mitigate them. All that is essential when it comes to risk monitoring and controlling, so that once you get into the executing and monitoring and controlling phase of a project, you're able to implement them. Now, this also means that even after the project's done, you still have to conduct various risk management processes because you want to make sure that, for example, your product doesn't go to crap, or that, it doesn't expose your customers' personal information or their credit card numbers, right? And in the case of Chernobyl, their biggest risk was, of course, radiation contamination, especially if there's a failure in the reactor. But here's the thing. As we know in the introduction to the Chernobyl disaster, a lot of the employees, the personnel, were not properly trained in the first place, which we'll get to in the second part. But they had established policies and procedures, but they weren't being followed exactly. And as mentioned, workers on the project closed the power that regulated the system, closed the emergency safety systems, as well as making other mistakes, which of course led to the reactor becoming unstable. And with all these mistakes combined, the chain reaction went out of control, leading to many explosions. And even in some other research, it also turned out that I think it was Sweden that was able to detect radiation in the air, and there was radiation on their employees' clothes. But of course, it wasn't severe to where they could be poisoned or anything of that. But they immediately caught on that something was not right. And that, of course, leads into the second point of our risk management process. The second point of the purposes that risk management processes ensures is that all risks are understood by the entire team to ensure adherence to the established processes and procedures of risk monitoring and controlling. So in the planning phase as project managers, it's not just about planning everything out and you just do it. You have to sit with your team as well and come to agreement and understanding, not just agreement, understanding as well, in terms of how you're going to manage, plan, execute, and monitor and control your risks, especially on a project. And the same is done when you think about like a manufacturing facility, for example, where they have to think about all the potential risks that could impact their production lines, such as lack of available resources, whether that's the physical product itself, a machine, or even a resource as in a person. Project managers also have to think about that. And when they plan out the risk management process, the entire team has to understand this. And as we see with Chernobyl, that wasn't the case because the employees, first off, weren't even trained properly to begin with. But because of the lack of proper training, they didn't have a true understanding to why these processes were in place, the purpose of what they're supposed to do, and potentially to prevent any issues that would occur. And thus, of course, because of this lack of understanding, there was explosions that caused a large fireball, which blew off the concrete lid of the reactor and its hefty steel, and it caused a huge number of radioactivity to be released into the air, which caused about 320,000 people to be evacuated nearby and killed 2 people in the initial explosion. In addition to that, we now see that Chernobyl and everything around it is now almost a complete wasteland in essence, frozen in time from what used to live there. And it's uninhabitable still to this day. And that, of course, leads into our third point on the purposes of risk management processes ensures. The third and final point of the purposes that risk management processes ensures is the understanding of the consequence of action or inaction towards the risk management, monitoring, controlling. So as a project manager, you've gone through the process of establishing these processes and procedures. Then you've gone through the process of ensuring that the entire team understands these risks to adhere to the processes and procedures. But now you have to establish understanding of the consequences of action or inaction towards a specific risk while utilizing those processes and procedures. And we see this a lot, and not just projects. I know this is a project management channel, but we also can look at various incidents like the Target breach, for example, which they kind of had, I think, 2 or 3 of those, where people were hacking their point of sale systems and stealing credit card information. What was their action? Their action was really an inaction to update their software accordingly. For another example, 9/11, where we had various departments that had small information about these, terrorists that took these planes and crashed into the towers in the Pentagon, and yet through inaction, they refused to speak to each other. That's a whole nother video of itself. But then you also have the Challenger space shuttle, where you had engineers saying, hey, don't do this. And through action, which is inaction in itself, that they didn't stop the process and say, okay, we need to resolve this, and instead just went forward with it. And the same thing goes for Chernobyl. Now, again, we all know these employees were not trained. So through inaction, no one thought, hey, maybe we should first and foremost maybe do an audit of our processes and procedures for the risks to ensure that they're clear, they're concise, they're specific, and very easy to follow. And maybe we need to take the time to really, truly train our people so that they adhere to these processes and procedures all the time. And if they have one slip up, it's minor and it doesn't cause a huge explosion and then a snowball effect of other consequences later. But that wasn't even the case. And yeah, it's fascinating because as part of risk management, when you're identifying risks, you are looking at the quote unquote lessons learned. And I mean, my gosh, they had the Manhattan Project as an example of a lessons learned, especially with the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You also had all kinds of other consequences like Project Sunshine, where they went to see what was the actual causes of radiation on the human body. That's actually one of those interesting projects. But in the case of Chernobyl, one of their consequences was that it led to a severe amount of radiation being released into the atmosphere, which of course that was spread by the wind to places such as Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. It affected human life by causing long-term negative health issues, sickness due to exposure to radiation, which led to death for some, contamination of millions of farmlands and forests, which caused livestock to be born with deformities. In addition to that, it caused international commotion about radioactive emissions after the Soviet government confessed about the incident. So at first, they didn't want to admit to it, but then they had to. And then the Soviet Union established a circle radius covering about 1,017 square miles around the disaster site to prohibit people from entering the area. But later, it got expanded to 1,600 square miles, including the very radiated areas around the first exclusion zone. And at the end of the day, we as project managers have to ensure that we establish these things when it comes to risk management. Because at the end of the day, those risks, the consequences of those risks, impact not just us, and not just our team, and not just our stakeholders, but it could also impact others who had no involvement whatsoever. Thank you all for joining me on this video podcast, and I hope to see you in the next.